The snakes won't bite. It's funny how things process differently when you're young. It took a couple years for me to sink in how strange the situation was and how creepy it was. Back in 5th grade, my buddies and I used to play airsoft guns and have our little deathmatch battles up in the hills behind our houses. We all grew up in a very safe, affluent suburban neighborhood and would regularly explore and play. One summer evening, approaching dusk, we started our match and split into 2 teams of 4. My friend Tegan and I stayed together and ran up the hill a bit to a concrete water runoff. This proved to be a great spot to hide and overlook the action from above. While up at our post, Tegan made it apparent to me that a man was watching and began descending towards us from higher up on the hill. At this point, we weren't alarmed, just curious. The man approached through the tall bush and jumped the fence to where we were stationed. He looked pretty normal from what I could recall, albeit his clothes were a tad dirty. The man approached my friend Tegan, immediately grabbing his arm, and pulled out a syringe. The man looked at both of us and calmly said, "If I poke you with this, the snakes won't bite." For a moment, Tegan and I were very confused. We both had this kid we can trust adults kind of mindset that was quickly challenged by this man. From what I recall, we pretty quickly understood this wasn't right, and we started to yell and I began to shoot my airsoft gun into the air. Our friends came out hiding and saw us up on the hill. The man obviously realized all these kids have weapons and immediately took off back in the direction he came. I remember us all laughing about it, finishing our airsoft match, and then proceeding to go home and tell our parents. This then led to school announcements, a section in the local paper, and neighborhood watch signs. They never found the guy. My dad's friend mysteriously disappeared. This isn't an encounter of mine, and it's also one of my very first posts on the subreddit and on Reddit in general, so a bunch of stories all over the place. In fact, now I think of it, this may not entirely fit on the subreddit. But anyways, I live in the southern part of California, Orange County to be exact. My dad grew up here before moving in with my mother on the East Coast. When he was a kid or a young teen, most of our neighborhood was full of orange groves. He and his friends used to explore and smoke weed in them. My dad told me he once had his friend whose name I can't remember, Jack maybe. He was the son of a woman named Frances Mary Klug, a religious cult leader who thought she'd been visited by God or Jesus or something. She claimed to be a prophet and eventually broke away from the Catholic Church to form the Hill of Hope congregation. The woman had a lot of followers. Her son was definitely not a follower, as he was often hanging out with my dad in the groves, smoking weed, and talking shit on his mother and her followers. Frances, according to my dad, always had these bodyguard dudes around her, who oftentimes were armed and would enter the church armed. This made her far scarier than any elderly crazy woman should be. They'd go looking for Jack, forcing him to sometimes hide in the groves. The Hill of Hope eventually created a fort of some sort in Carbon Canyon, fitting because a bunch of creepy-ass fuck things go on there all the time. At this time, the fort and compound was in the process of being built. Jack and his mother had been bumping heads more often, and my dad noticed that her son wasn't around as often. Eventually, he stopped making appearances altogether. Frances Klug eventually up and left with a lover of hers to another country. Some sources say that she returned eventually and died at the hill in 2009, but the Hill of Hope is still there, in Carbon Canyon. They're very secretive and don't let outsiders onto their property. My dad swears that Klug had her followers kill her son and hide his body underneath the cement formation of the hill. The kid disappeared without a trace. Klug didn't even seem fazed. and the cement was laid down shortly after. My dad says, it's too much of a coincidence. He never did hear from his friend again. Stalkers in the Canyon. About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA County. Bordering my town was a large carnivorous town known as Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area empathetically known as Hell's Gates, stories of cultic activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. The kind of shit you hear about any place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on, the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the King of the Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambience to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should know that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so traveling out to a remote area preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences admittedly had me thinking twice about the decision. At the top of the canyon, there was a small residential area, a few ritzy houses surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off into other directions, but ultimately culminate after a couple miles or so at the base of a steep hill, adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divvied up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead, around 1 a.m. by this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up his first shot while Jeff, our other friend, and I watched. Eventually, he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us, as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the bush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it was the type of truck typically owned by backwood folks who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly we were spooked by this point, the three of us speculating as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, while Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So, with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave towards the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails, barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it onto the water tower, climbed the hill to the top, and took in the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point, it was around 3 a.m. Dave decides that he's got all the shots he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to heading down before it gets too late. seeing as how all of us have classes in just a few hours. Just as we're preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared shitless, the three of us just slide off the side of the hill into the bush, clinging to plants and rocks, as the truck finally made it atop the hill, slowly driving around the tower. We could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting for nearly 10 minutes, while also trying not to make any noise, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail, not more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of its headlights, moseying around while looking at the ground. He then knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. This next part still chills me to the bone. As my friends and I huddled together watching in complete terror, another man wearing a long dark parka emerged from the brush, right where we had been hiking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently, he had been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a long while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got in the truck and drove off down one of the forks in the trail. We sat in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made like hell back to the car, down the canyon, and back to our campus. Just in time for class.